API Gateway is a fully managed service that makes it easy for developers to create, publish, maintain, monitor, and secure APIs actually at any scale. API Gateway acts as a front door to applications. It can handle RESTful API, HTTP APIs, or WebSocket APIs. In this lab, we'll configure an API gateway and we'll get to know some of the features that it has. There are some prerequisites that we'll need to take care of. First, we'll install Lambda functions that will act as the backend for the application. We'll also install a couple of tools. We'll use the console tool to interact with API gateway, as well as Postman to interact outside of the AWS environment through the internet with the API gateway. We will also configure authentication for the API and learn how to use it. In the workshop guide, you'll find the links for the prerequisites that you need to install. You'll have the link for the AWS CLI as well as the Postman. Those two should be installed. You also need to download the Lambda functions that will act as the backend. So click the link and save the file in your favorite folder. We will go back to this file later to do some changes to it. On the bottom left side, you will find the link that you already used for the console, an additional link to configure the AWS CLI tool. When you follow the link, you will get the configuration to each one of the operating systems that it supports. So copy the parameters and paste them in your terminal window to configure the CLI tool. The next part is not documented. What we'll need to do is to open the file that we've just downloaded and change the runtime parameters from Java 8 to Java 21 in order for the Lambda function to function correctly. So we'll go to line 9 and do the change from Java 8 to Java 21 as well as in line 17. Save the file and we will use it in the next step. In the next step, we will need to deploy the Lambda functions. In order to deploy the Lambda functions, we will use infrastructure as code. We will use AWS CLI to run a CloudFormation deployment of the Lambda functions. For this, we need to set up the environment of the AWS CLI. So I'll copy the credentials according to the operating system that I have and paste it in a terminal window. Now I'll clear the window and I'll check to see that I have the file with the correct permissions. I see that the permissions are not correct, so I'll set up the right permissions. Okay, I'll clear the screen and I'll copy the command for the deployment, paste it in the terminal window. I need to make sure that the path is correct and run the command. It will take several minutes for the Lambda function to be deployed. I'll close the window and get back soon. Okay, so the script is now ended. We can see that the operation is successful, and we will go to the console to see that the deployment is done correctly. So now we're back in the console window, and in order to check that the Lambda functions are correctly deployed, we will go to Lambda. And under functions, we can see that we have both of the functions installed. That's it for this section. Now that the backend Lambda are installed, let's configure our first API. For this, we will go to the API gateway. If you don't have it in the menu, you can always search it in the service bar. So I'll type API gateway and I'll go to the API. We are going to create a RESTful API. So we'll scroll down and the API gateway that we'll select is a RESTful API. We'll click Build. Okay, we are going to create a new API. So new API is already selected. We'll give the API a name. We'll give it a description. And it's going to be an original. We'll create the API. After the API gateway is created, we'll create a resource for it. So we go to create resource. We'll give our resource a name. So whenever we will go to /price per meter, we will select this resource. And this resource now needs to be connected to the Lambda function. In order to connect to the Lambda function, we'll need to decide on the method. The method that we are going to select for this Lambda function is post. So we're going to post to a Lambda function that exists in US East 1, and the name of the Lambda function is calculate cost per unit. We'll select it and we'll click create. Now we have the API gateway created and we have a resource at /price per meter and we'll use the method post for it. Then this will be sent to a Lambda function and we can see which Lambda function it will be sent to if we click over here. We can see that the name of the Lambda function is calculate cost per unit. Let's test to see that it is functioning. We'll go to test. And we have in the Work Studio the JSON that needs to be posted to the Lambda function in order to invoke it. I'll copy the JSON from the Workshop Studio and paste it over here. And I'll click the test button. We can see that we've got now a response. The response code is 200, which means it's okay. And we can see the body of the response over here. The API gateway is working. Let's continue to the next section. Using an API gateway, we can map and transform data from one format to another. A JSON path expression can be used to transform the integration payload to any desired format. Moreover, we have models, and with the models we can define the structure of this payload. So having a model is very useful if we want to generate an SDK, a software development kit for our application. First, we'll build a model. And then according to this model, we will be able to transform both the request payload and the response payload to match this model. So we'll go to the API gateway. We'll select the calculate price API that we created, and we'll build the model for this API. Now let's create the model. We'll give the model a name. The content type of the model is going to be application JSON. We will provide a description to the model. In Workshop Studio, you can find the schema that we want to use, so just copy and paste it over here. We can now see that we have our new model over here, and if we select it, we can see the model detail. In the model details, we can see the definitions of our variables. We have the price from type number, size from type number, unit will be a string, and down payment again will be from type number. Okay, now that we have the model, we'll transform the request payload. For this, we'll go back to the resource. We'll select the post method. We'll select the integration request either from here or from the tabs. We'll edit it. And we'll request a body password if there are no models defined. And we'll scroll down to the mapping template and add our mapping. The content type is application JSON again. We'll generate a template according to the cost calculator request, and we will change the template body according to what we expect to receive. We have a copy of this definition in the Workshop Studio, so copy this definition from the Workshop Studio and paste it over here instead. We'll now save it. And now we'll define the integration response. We'll go to the response, we'll edit it. The content is passed through. We'll add mapping. The content type again is application JSON, and we'll select method pass-through. We'll save. We will now test to see that the model and the transformation of the request and response are working correctly. We will go to test. In the Workshop Studio, you will find the body of the payload that we want to send. So we'll copy it and paste it over here. Notice that we also now have the down payment that we didn't have before. I'll run the test. When we look now at the output, we can see that the down payment was added to the total cost. So the model is working, as well as the payload transform. Now that we have the schema in place, we want to validate and ensure that the incoming requests are properly formatted and contain the proper attributes. We can check this from the body perspective and also from the header perspective, or even both. So what we'll do next is that we will validate that the body is properly formatted before we post the information to the Lambda function. To do this, we will go back to our API. We'll select the post method request, and we'll edit this request. We will validate the body, and in the body we will add the content type. Again, application JSON, and the model is the model that we've selected for the calculator request. We'll save it. We'll now run a test to see that it is working. We go to test. From Workshop Studio, you can copy a sample request of the message that we're going to send and paste it over here. Notice that we have price, size, unit, and down payment. They are all from text type. I'll run the test, and immediately we can see that the test fails. We can either edit the request and make sure that the variables are of type number, or you can copy from Workshop Studio the correct block and paste it over here instead. Now, price, size, and down payment are of type number, and unit is of type text, as we defined in the schema. We'll run the test again. And this time we see that we have a status code 200, which is okay. And we have the pricing calculation in place, which means that the Lambda function is functioning properly. So now we have an API gateway, but the API gateway is wide open. That means that anyone can access it. In order to protect the API, we should implement some sort of authentication. The API gateway supports a few types of authentication like IAMOauth or Cognito user pools, and also supports a custom authorization written in Lambda function, for example. In this lab, we will configure Cognito and connect it to the API gateway. To configure Cognito authentication with API Gateway, we will need to follow a few steps. First, we'll create a Cognito user pool. Then we will create a user. We'll log in as this user, and we'll update the API Gateway to use the authentication. So we will start by creating a Cognito user pool. For this, we'll go to Cognito. It is the first pool that we have, so we'll create a new user pool. The sign in option that we'll select is email, and we'll click next. Now we can decide that we want to enable MFA, a multi-factor authentication. So we can select MFA, and we can use applications like Google Authenticator to use it as a multi-factor authentication application if needed. We'll proceed to the next step. In the sign-up options, we don't need to configure anything, so we can just move to the next step as well. Now we will configure authentication using email. So we will select Send Email with Cognito, and we will proceed to the next step. In this step, we will provide the pool with a name, and we will also name the application. We'll scroll down and make sure that Don't Generate Client Secret is selected. We'll open the Advanced Client Settings, and we need to allow the admin user password auth. And click Next. We'll review the information and create the user pool. At the top of the screen, create the view details. Now there are some details that we need to note. Take a note of the user pool ID. You can copy and paste it in a text file for your convenience. And now we'll scroll to Application Integration. We'll scroll down and we'll make a note of the client ID as well. We can now proceed to create a user. To create a user, we'll scroll up to Users, and from here we'll select the Create User. We don't want to send an invitation. Add your email address. We'll mark the email as verified, and we'll add a password. You can see the password if you use the toggle switch. We'll create the user, and next we will try to log in as this user. We will now use the AWS CLI command on the terminal to try and log in with the user to Cognito. For this, I'll bring on the terminal window and also a notepad with the notes that I took from before. So I have the user pool, I have the client ID, I have the email that I'm going to use, the username, and the password. Remember that this user needs to change the password at first login. So I've already prepared a password over here for the next login. From Workshop Studio, copy the command that logs in the user to Cognito. I'll copy and I'll paste it over here. You will see in the command that there are some placeholders for the note that we took before. So let's change this line and add, instead of the placeholders, the notes that we took before. The new command will look like this. Instead of the placeholder for the user pool, I've added the user pool from my notes. For the client ID, I did the same. And now we'll copy the whole command and we'll paste it in the terminal window. Notice that to answer this request, I must use the same session So I'll copy the session ID from here and I'll add it to my notes. This is a very long line, so don't be alarmed. Next, we will copy from Workshop Studio the next command that will send the new password to Cognito. I'll go to the Workshop Studio, copy the command and paste it over here. There is one thing that I would like to change in this command from the Workshop Studio, and this is the area of the password. Because our password is using sometimes some special characters, I will change the user and password and just add the following. So now I will do the same. I will change the placeholders with the information that I have from before, and I'll construct the new command. The new command will look like this. Now we need to add the session ID in the placeholder. So I'll copy the session ID and paste it in the placeholder. I'll copy the whole command, get back to the terminal window, press Q to quit from the answer. Let me clear the screen and I'll paste the new command. As you can see, I've received an error, and the error says that the session expired. So the session has some time. You cannot expect the session to be open forever. If you encounter this error, what we'll need to do is to start from the beginning. You will need to send the command again for the login, copy the new session ID, and send the password change with the new session ID. So what I will do now, I will clear the screen and we will run everything again very fast. Paste the new command with the new session ID and run it. This time we can see that it is successful and we've managed to change the password. The response contains some important information. The ID token is the OpenID Connect compatible ID token that the API gateway uses in order to authenticate calls. This token needs to be passed to the API in the authorization header. So we'll make a copy of this token and put it in our notes. We can now go back to the API gateway and update the API gateway authentication. I'll go back to the API gateway, select the API, I'll select authorize, and we'll create a new authorizer. We'll provide the authorizer name. It will be of type Cognito. We'll select the user pool and the token source is going to be method request header authorization. We will create the authorizer. Now let's test the authorizer. We'll select the authorizer and because we're using a method to request a header authorization, we will copy and paste the token ID from the session before and paste it over here. I'll pull my notes. I'll copy the ID token and paste it over here and press the test authorizer. we can see that the response code is 200. It means that the authorizer is now connected to the API gateway, and we need to apply it to the post method that we had before. We'll go back to the APIs, select our API, and select the post method. We can see that the method request currently is not authorizing. So we'll click Edit, and in the authorization, we'll select the Cognito user pool that we attached. We can see that now we have the user pool authorization attached. Up to now, we've tested the API using the API gateway. And now that we have made all the necessary configuration, we have the authorization in place, it's time to deploy our API. I'll select the post and deploy the API. We're going to set up a new stage. We'll give the stage a name, for example, dev. We'll give it a description. And click deploy. Okay, now we'll go to our dev stage and we'll have a look at the post method. This is the invoke URL. Copy this URL as we will make use of it in the next stages. Up to now, we've been testing the API using the local API gateway. And now that we have the API deployed, we'll run a test using an external tool. We're going to make use of the tool Postman that we've downloaded in Pew-Requisites. I'll switch now to Postman. Now we'll run a test using Postman. So we already have the invoke URL, but there are good chances that our token has already expired. So we need to generate a new token to use. You can go back to Workshop Studio and copy the command from the previous section. I'll copy the command and paste it in the terminal. And I'll receive a new ID token. I'll copy the ID token, save it over here for further use. And now I'll switch to Postman. In Postman, we'll create a new query. I'll add invoke URL. The method needs to be post. In the header, I will add the key for authentication. And I'll paste the ID token over here. We'll go to body. We're going to send raw data of type JSON. And from Workshop Studio, copy the body that we're going to send and paste it over here. We are now ready to test our API by sending this post. As you see, we received the answer. So we now have the API up and running and secured with authentication, working from the internet. That's it for this lab. Okay, in Postman, in Postman, in Postman, we'll create a new query. In Postman, we'll create a new query. I'll add invoke URL. Invoke URL needs to be post. The method needs to be post. The method needs to be post. In the headers, I will add the key for authentication. And the ID, and I'll paste the ID token over here. We'll go to body. We're going to send raw data of type JSON. And from the workshop studio, copy the body that we're going to send. And from workshop studio, copy the body that we're going to send and paste it over here. We are now ready to send the query. We are now ready to test our API by sending this post. As you can see, we've received the information as expected. As you see, we received the answer. So we now have the API up and running and secured with authentication, working from the internet. That's it for this lab.